Welcome to ReadingBear. Today, OP tries warning his boss about a costly mistake, but gets dismissed as a paranoid code monkey. Let's see how this plays out. So this happened at my previous job at a mid-sized software company that specialized in financial management systems for banks and credit unions. I worked there for about 8 years as a senior systems engineer, basically the guy who kept all the servers running and made sure our software deployments went smoothly. The company had grown pretty fast over the years. And with growth came the usual corporate politics and ego trips that make life interesting. Our main product was this complex banking software that handled everything from customer accounts to loan processing to regulatory compliance reporting. The software was deployed across hundreds of financial institutions, and any major screw-up could literally shut down a bank's operations for days. No pressure, right? The cast of characters for this story is pretty simple. There was me, the guy trying to do his job properly. Then there was my boss, who I'll call middle manager, Mike, though everyone just called him Mike. Mike had been promoted to IT director about 2 years before this incident, mainly because he was good at playing corporate politics and sucking up to the executives. His technical knowledge was limited at best, but he made up for it with an oversized ego and an absolute refusal to admit when he was wrong about anything. Above Mike was the CTO, a guy who actually knew his stuff but was usually too busy dealing with board meetings and strategic planning to get involved in day-to-day operations. The CEO was one of those typical startup-turned-corporate types who loved throwing around buzzwords and talking about disrupting the industry, while having no clue how the actual product worked. The trouble started during what should have been a routine software update. We'd been working on version 8.3 of our core banking platform for months. This wasn't just a minor bug fix release. It included some major changes to how the system handled regulatory compliance reporting, specifically around anti-money laundering requirements that had been updated by federal regulators. The development team had done their usual testing in our staging environment, and everything looked good. But here's where it gets interesting. About 3 days before we were scheduled to push this update to our production servers, I was doing my own systems check when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The new compliance module was trying to access a database table that didn't exist in our production environment. Somehow, the developers had created this table in staging but never added the migration script to create it in production. This wasn't just a minor oversight. This table contained critical data mappings that the entire compliance reporting system depended on. Now, you might think this would be an easy fix. Just create the table, right? Wrong. The missing table wasn't just empty. It was supposed to be populated with thousands of rows of regulatory mapping data that had been manually entered by our compliance team over several months. Without this data, any bank trying to generate their required federal reports would get nothing but error messages. I immediately started digging deeper into the issue, and what I found made it even worse. The compliance module wasn't just going to fail gracefully when it couldn't find the table. Due to some sloppy error handling in the code, it was going to crash the entire reporting subsystem, which would then trigger cascade failures in other parts of the system. I ran some tests in an isolated environment to confirm my suspicions. And sure enough, the moment the compliance module tried to run its first report, the whole thing went down like a house of cards. Not only would banks be unable to generate compliance reports, but the system crash would also prevent them from processing certain types of transactions, updating customer account information, and performing end-of-day balance reconciliations. This was bad, really bad. We were talking about potentially shutting down critical banking operations for hundreds of institutions simultaneously. The kind of bad that gets your company sued into oblivion and lands executives in federal prison for failing to maintain critical financial infrastructure. I spent the next day documenting everything I'd found, creating detailed test cases that demonstrated the problem, and preparing a comprehensive report that outlined both the immediate issue and its potential consequences. I even put together a proposed solution that would involve rolling back the update, properly creating and populating the missing database table, and then redeploying with proper testing. The solution wasn't complicated, but it would delay the rollout by about 2 weeks. In the grand scheme of things, 2 weeks was nothing compared to the disaster we'd face if we pushed the broken update to production. So I scheduled a meeting with Mike to go over my findings. I figured this would be a pretty straightforward conversation, show him the problem, explain the risks, get approval to delay the rollout, and fix the issue properly. I mean, what reasonable person would want to risk shutting down hundreds of banks just to meet an arbitrary deadline? I should have known better. The meeting was scheduled for Tuesday morning at 9. I showed up with my laptop, a printed copy of my report, and test results that clearly demonstrated the problem. Mike was already in the conference room, looking impatient, and checking his phone every few seconds. I started walking him through my findings, showing him exactly how the missing database table would cause the system to crash. I pulled up my test environment and demonstrated the failure in real time. I showed him the error logs, the stack traces, everything. The evidence was absolutely conclusive. Mike listened for maybe 5 minutes before cutting me off. He basically told me that I was overthinking things and that the development team had already tested everything thoroughly. When I tried to explain that the staging environment didn't match production, he waved his hand dismissively and said the developers knew what they were doing. I tried a different approach, focusing on the potential business impact. I explained that if we pushed this update and it failed, we'd have hundreds of angry customers, potential regulatory violations, and lawsuits that could put the company out of business. Mike just laughed. He actually laughed. He leaned back in his chair and told me that I was being paranoid and that these kinds of minor technical glitches happened all the time without causing any real problems. He said I needed to stop being such a worrywart and focus on the big picture. At this point, I was getting frustrated, but I tried one more time. I offered to show him the specific code that would cause the crash, to walk him through exactly how the cascade failure would occur. Mike stood up and told me he didn't need to see any more technical details because he understood the system better than I did. That's when he dropped the line. That still makes my eye twitch when I think about it. He said he'd been managing IT projects since before I got out of college, and that he knew better than some code monkey what was safe to deploy to production. Code monkey. That's what he called me. A senior systems engineer with 8 years of experience at the company. And he called me a code monkey. But here's where it gets really good. Mike didn't just dismiss my concerns. He gave me a direct order. He told me that the update was going out as scheduled on Friday morning, and that it was my job to make sure it deployed smoothly. He said if I had any problems with that, I could take it up with HR. Now, I probably should have gone over his head at this point. I could have taken my findings to the CTO or even the CEO, but I was angry. And when I get angry, I sometimes make decisions that are technically correct but practically stupid. So I decided to give Mike exactly what he wanted. Malicious compliance at its finest. I sent him an email later that day, copying HR and the CTO for documentation purposes. The email was very professional and straightforward. I confirmed that despite my technical concerns about the database compatibility issues I had identified, Mike had directed me to proceed with the deployment as scheduled. I stated that I would comply with his instructions and ensure the update was deployed exactly as he had ordered. The key phrase was, exactly as he had ordered. Mike had specifically told me to deploy the update as scheduled and to not make any unauthorized changes or modifications. He'd even added that if I tried to fix things that weren't actually broken, I'd be in serious trouble. So that's exactly what I did. I followed his orders to the letter. I spent the rest of the week preparing for the deployment, but not in the way you might think. Instead of trying to find workarounds or partial fixes, I focused on documentation and monitoring. I set up detailed logging on all our production servers, so we'd have a complete record of exactly what happened when the system failed. I prepared rollback procedures that could be executed quickly once the inevitable disaster occurred. I even drafted incident reports and customer communication templates in advance. What I didn't do was fix the missing database table or modify the deployment package in any way. Mike had been very clear that the update should go out exactly as developed, with no modifications from the paranoid code monkey. I also sent a few more emails during the week, always CCing the appropriate people. I confirmed deployment times, verified that all stakeholders were aware of the scheduled update, and reminded everyone that this was proceeding under Mike's direct authorization despite technical concerns that had been raised and documented. Friday morning arrived, and I was ready. The deployment was scheduled to start at 6 a.m. Eastern Time, which would allow us to complete the rollout during the maintenance window when most banks were closed or operating with minimal transaction volume. Mike showed up at the office around 7 a.m., just as the deployment was entering its final phase. He seemed pretty pleased with himself, probably thinking he'd successfully managed another IT project despite the objections of his overly cautious staff. The deployment itself went smoothly from a technical perspective. All the new code was successfully installed on our production servers. The databases were updated with the new schema changes that were actually included in the migration scripts, and the system started up without any immediate errors. For about 45 minutes, everything seemed fine. Our monitoring system showed normal operation, and the few early morning transactions that were being processed went through without problems. Then the compliance reporting module tried to run its first automated check. I was sitting at my desk, watching the system logs in real time, when it happened. At exactly 7:43 a.m., the compliance module attempted to query the missing database table. The query failed with a table not found error, which should have been caught by the error handling code. Instead, due to the sloppy programming I'd identified earlier, the error caused an unhandled exception that crashed the entire compliance subsystem. The subsystem crash triggered a cascade failure in the transaction processing module, which then brought down the customer account management system. Within 15 minutes, our entire production environment was effectively dead in the water. The first customer complaints started rolling in around 8 a.m. A credit union in Ohio called to report that their system was showing error messages whenever they tried to process loan payments. A community bank in Texas couldn't update customer account balances. A regional bank in Florida found that their ATM network was rejecting all transactions. By 8:30 a.m., our customer service phone lines were completely overwhelmed. We had hundreds of financial institutions calling to report system outages, and the volume was increasing exponentially as more banks opened for business. Mike's confident demeanor evaporated pretty quickly. He started running around the office, demanding to know what was happening and why nobody had anticipated these problems. When he saw me calmly working at my desk, documenting the failures and preparing status reports, he practically screamed at me to fix whatever was broken. I looked up from my computer and reminded him that he had specifically ordered me not to make any unauthorized changes to the system. He'd been very clear that I should deploy the update exactly as developed, without any modifications from the paranoid code monkey who was overthinking things. The look on his face was priceless. You could see the exact moment when he realized that his own orders had caused this disaster, and that he was now stuck with the consequences of his decision to ignore the technical concerns I'd raised. But it gets better. Mike then tried to order me to implement an immediate fix, probably thinking he could just override his previous instructions. I politely reminded him that any emergency fixes would need to be properly authorized and documented, especially given the scope of the current outage. I suggested he might want to contact the CTO and CEO to discuss the situation, since we were now looking at a company-wide crisis that was affecting hundreds of customers and potentially violated several regulatory requirements for maintaining critical financial systems. The next few hours were absolute chaos. The CTO got pulled into emergency meetings with the executive team. The CEO was fielding angry calls from our biggest customers. The legal department was trying to assess our liability exposure. The public relations team was drafting statements for the financial press. Meanwhile, I was busy implementing the rollback procedures I'd prepared in advance. The actual fix was relatively straightforward. We just needed to restore the previous version of the software while we properly addressed the database compatibility issues. But rolling back a system-wide update across hundreds of production deployments takes time, especially when you're doing it under emergency conditions while customers are screaming and executives are panicking. It took us almost 6 hours to complete the rollback and restore normal operations. 6 hours, during which hundreds of banks and credit unions were operating with severely limited functionality, unable to process many types of transactions or generate critical reports. The financial impact was staggering. Our company faced immediate penalties for violating service-level agreements with customers. Several major clients threatened to terminate their contracts unless we provided substantial compensation for their losses. The regulatory implications alone were enough to keep our legal team busy for months. But the real kicker came when the final damage assessment was completed. Between direct penalties, customer compensation, legal fees, emergency contractor costs, and lost business from clients who decided to switch to competitors, the total cost of Mike's decision exceeded $4 million. $4 million because our IT director was too arrogant to listen to a senior engineer's technical concerns about a database compatibility issue. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The CEO called an all-hands meeting the following Monday to address what he termed a catastrophic failure of project management and technical oversight. He didn't mention Mike by name during the meeting, but everyone knew exactly who he was talking about. The CTO launched a formal investigation into how the deployment had been approved despite documented technical concerns. As part of that investigation, all of my emails and reports were reviewed, including the detailed documentation I'd provided showing the exact nature of the problem and its potential consequences. It became very clear, very quickly, that I had done exactly what any reasonable engineer should do. I'd identified a critical issue, documented it thoroughly, escalated it to management, and provided a clear solution. When my concerns were dismissed and I was given direct orders to proceed anyway, I had complied exactly as instructed, while ensuring proper documentation of the decision-making process. Mike, on the other hand, had ignored clear technical warnings, made decisions based on ego rather than evidence, and then tried to blame his subordinates when his poor judgment resulted in a company-wide crisis. The investigation concluded that Mike had failed to exercise proper technical oversight and had created a situation where critical system vulnerabilities were deployed to production despite being clearly identified and documented by qualified staff. Mike was gone within 2 weeks. He didn't even get the dignity of a resignation. He was terminated for cause, which meant no severance package and no positive references for future employment. But the story doesn't end there. The company also implemented new procedures requiring technical sign-off from senior engineers before any major system deployments. They created an escalation process for situations where management decisions conflicted with technical recommendations. And they established an independent technical review board that could override management decisions in cases involving system safety or regulatory compliance. Essentially, they put in place all the safeguards that could have prevented this disaster if they'd existed before Mike's ego got the better of his judgment. As for me, I got a promotion. The CTO personally thanked me for my thorough documentation and professional handling of the situation. He acknowledged that I had done everything correctly, from identifying the problem, to following proper escalation procedures, to complying with management directives while ensuring appropriate documentation. The promotion came with a substantial raise, expanded responsibilities, and a direct reporting line to the CTO that bypassed middle management entirely. I also got a written commendation in my personnel file acknowledging my technical expertise and professional conduct during the crisis. But honestly, the best part was watching Mike clean out his office. He tried to maintain some dignity, but everyone in the company knew exactly why he was leaving. His replacement was a technical professional with actual systems engineering experience. Someone who understood that listening to your senior staff isn't a sign of weakness. It's a basic requirement of competent management. The missing database table issue was fixed within a week of Mike's departure. The new update was properly tested, the database schema was corrected, and the compliance reporting module was deployed without incident. It took about 15 minutes to implement the fix I'd originally proposed, the same fix that could have prevented the entire disaster if Mike had bothered to listen. Looking back on the whole experience, I learned a valuable lesson about malicious compliance. Sometimes, the best way to deal with an unreasonable manager isn't to fight them directly. It's to give them exactly what they ask for, and let the consequences speak for themselves. Mike wanted to override technical concerns and deploy the update exactly as developed, without modifications from the paranoid code monkey. So that's exactly what I did. I followed his orders to the letter, documented everything thoroughly, and let the inevitable disaster unfold exactly as I'd predicted. The company learned that technical expertise matters more than management ego. The customers learned that our new leadership was committed to preventing similar failures in the future. And Mike learned that calling your senior engineers code monkeys while ignoring their professional advice is a great way to end your career. As for whether I felt bad about not going over Mike's head to prevent the disaster, I'll be honest, not really. I had done everything professionally appropriate to raise my concerns. I had documented the risks clearly and provided viable solutions. When those concerns were dismissed and I was given direct orders, I complied exactly as instructed while ensuring proper documentation. If Mike had been a reasonable manager who simply disagreed with my assessment, I might have felt differently. But he wasn't reasonable. He was arrogant, dismissive, and insulting. He made it clear that he didn't value technical expertise and didn't want input from his staff. So when his poor judgment resulted in exactly the disaster I'd warned him about, I didn't lose any sleep over it. Sometimes people need to face the full consequences of their decisions in order to learn that expertise and experience actually matter. The company is doing much better now, with proper technical oversight and management that actually listens to their engineering staff. We haven't had any major system failures since implementing the new procedures, and our customer satisfaction ratings have improved significantly. And me? I'm still there, still keeping the systems running, still catching potential problems before they become disasters. The difference is that now when I raise technical concerns, management actually listens instead of dismissing me as a paranoid code monkey. It's amazing how much more smoothly things run when the people making decisions actually understand and respect the technical expertise of their staff. Who would have thought? Anyway, thank you for watching. See you again tomorrow.